February 14, 1943, 4 in the morning. The wind coming down off the Atlas Mountains is cold and sharp. A thin curtain of dust drifts across the Fort Pass in central Tunisia, blurring the stars. American sentries on the high ground above the plain hear something. Engines. Diesel engines. Heavy ones. Not one vehicle or two, but dozens. Coming not from the west, where the Allied rear lies, but from the east, where the enemy is supposed to be waiting. They are not waiting. 140 German tanks roll out of the Fade, and Thala passes at 4 in the morning. Mark IIIs, Mark IVs. And in support, a company of the fearsome new Tiger tanks, their 88mm guns capable of killing every Allied tank in North Africa at battle range. Behind them come Panzer Grenadiers in half-tracks, motorcycle scouts, and self-propelled assault guns. 2 Panzer divisions, the 10th and the 21st, are in motion before the American front line has time to reach for a telephone. A few hours earlier, General Dwight Eisenhower, who had been promoted to full general just days before, had been at the front. He had visited the 2nd Corps headquarters near Tebessa the night before, toured forward positions, spoken to junior officers, and driven west toward his rear headquarters. He was cautious but not alarmed. His intelligence officers had told him the Germans might probe in this sector. A probe was expected. What is coming now is not a probe. 30 miles to the south, a second German column is already moving. That column is led by a man whose name, by this point in the war, can empty an American trench without a shot being fired. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Within hours, the plain around Sidi Bouzid will be on fire. Within days, roughly 300 Americans will be dead, 3,000 more wounded, and 3,000 marching into captivity. 183 American tanks will be burning in the Tunisian sand. 208 artillery pieces will be lost. 50 miles of hard-won ground will be given back in a rout so complete that Omar Bradley, years later, would call it the worst performance of the United States Army in their whole proud history. And yet, in the middle of that catastrophe, one American weapon will perform so well that Rommel himself, writing in a captured French farmhouse, will feel compelled to stop and record what he saw. That weapon is American artillery, and what Rommel wrote about it, and why he wrote it, is a story that has shaped how the United States Army fights to this day. Stay with me. To understand what happened at Kasserine Pass, you first have to understand who Rommel was by February of 1943, and what it meant for the United States Army to face him for the first time. Erwin Rommel was 51 years old. He had earned his Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor, as a young lieutenant leading mountain infantry on the Italian front in the First World War. During the Battle of Caporetto in October of 1917, he led a handful of men through fog and mountain passes and captured nearly 10,000 Italian prisoners and more than 80 artillery pieces at Monte Matajur, an action so audacious it left the Italian line in ruins. In the 1930s, he wrote a tactical textbook called Infantry Attacks, widely read in European and American military circles, and reportedly kept by George Patton in his command vehicle. In 1940, commanding the 7th Panzer Division in France, he drove so fast and so far ahead of his own supply lines that both the French and the German High Command itself lost track of him. The division earned the nickname the Ghost Division because it seemed to vanish from the map and reappear somewhere impossible. His men reached the English Channel in 11 days. Then came North Africa, February of 1941. Rommel arrived in Libya with a single light division and a mission to prop up the Italian front, which was collapsing. Within weeks, he had thrown the British back 600 miles. On June 21st of 1942, he captured the fortress port of Tobruk, taking approximately 33,000 prisoners in a single day. Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal on the spot, making him the youngest in the German army. Goebbels put his face on the front pages of every newspaper in the Reich. The British were unsettled in a way they rarely admitted. General Claude Auchinleck had to issue a written order to his commanders, instructing them to stop calling Rommel a Superman in front of the troops. Winston Churchill stood up in Parliament and, in a moment of extraordinary candour, called him a great general. That sentence was spoken while German tanks were less than 200 miles from the Suez Canal. Churchill said it because he believed it, and because he knew his people did too. Then came El Alamein, October and November of 1942. Bernard Montgomery, patient and meticulous, cornered the Afrika Korps between the Mediterranean coast and the Guettar Depression and ground it apart with superior numbers, superior supply, and massed artillery. Rommel retreated, 1,500 miles, from Egypt through Libya and into Tunisia. He fought for every mile, but he was retreating, and he knew what it meant. By the time he reached Tunisia in early 1943, he was physically broken, suffering from low blood pressure, chronic stomach problems, and nasal infections that had plagued him since the summer. He had asked Hitler twice to be relieved of command and allowed to come home to recover. Hitler refused both times. So Rommel stayed, looked at the map, and did what he always did when the situation was desperate. He attacked. While he retreated and while he plotted that attack, hundreds of miles to his west, the Americans arrived. Operation Torch, November 8, 1942. 3 Allied task forces landed simultaneously on the Atlantic coast of Morocco and the Mediterranean coast of Algeria, Casablanca, Oran, Algiers. The Vichy French resistance lasted 3 days. Within weeks, British and American columns were racing east through Algeria toward Tunisia, hoping to reach the Tunisian ports before the Germans could reinforce. They did not get there in time. The Germans flew in 3 divisions through the ports of Tunis and Bizerte, dug in along the eastern dorsal mountain range, and held. By January of 1943, the Axis had 2 armies in Tunisia, squeezed from both directions. Rommel's Panzer Army Africa, falling back from the east, faced Montgomery's 8th Army. In the north and centre, the newly formed Army Group Tunisia, under Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, faced the British 1st Army, the French 19th Corps, and the American 2nd Corps. The Allied commanders in Algiers believed it was almost over. Tunisia would fall in weeks, North Africa would be wrapped up, then Sicily, then Italy. Rommel saw something different. He saw an opportunity. If he could strike fast enough through the green American divisions holding the central Tunisian passes, he could capture the massive Allied supply base at Tebessa and split the 2 Allied armies in half. He had no illusions about the overall situation. The war in North Africa was lost. He had written as much to his wife Lucy. But a sharp blow against the Americans might buy Germany another 6 months in Tunisia, and, more importantly, might finally convince Hitler and the Italian High Command that Africa could no longer be held. He wanted to end it on his own terms before more men were wasted, and the Americans, for their part, were in no condition to stop him. Major General Lloyd Ralston Fredendall commanded the United States Second Corps. He was 59 years old, blunt-spoken, and deeply resistant to advice from officers with more combat experience. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, had called him one of the best corps commanders available and personally recommended him to Eisenhower. That confidence would prove badly misplaced. Fredendall ran his corps from a command post called Speedy Valley, 9 miles southeast of Tebessa in eastern Algeria, somewhere between 70 and 80 miles behind his own front line. He had ordered a company of the 19th Engineer Regiment to spend 3 weeks blasting parallel tunnels into a rock hillside to build him a bomb-proof underground headquarters. Each tunnel ran 160 feet into the hillside, braced every 4 feet with 10-inch timbers. The troops called it Lloyd's very last resort. What it did not have was any view of the battle. Fredendall almost never visited the front. He gave his orders by radio in an improvised personal code he believed would baffle German signals intelligence. It largely baffled his own officers instead. A typical Fredendall order directed commanders to move their walking boys to the high piece of ground east of the place where the Krauts had been spotted on Tuesday. His subordinates spent as much time translating the messages as executing them. Major General Orlando Ward, the 1st Armoured Division commander, later recorded that he could not recall a single visit from Fredendall to any armoured unit during the entire Tunisia campaign. The distance between Speedy Valley and the front was not merely physical. It was a distance of understanding. He also split his armour. The cardinal rule of American armoured doctrine, the principle George Patton had hammered into every officer he trained, was to concentrate your tanks and strike a decisive blow. Do not divide them across a wide front where they cannot support each other. Fredendall scattered the 1st Armoured Division's forces across a broad front that stretched from Sidi Bouzid westward towards Spatla and Tebessa. Major General Ward protested repeatedly. He was overruled. The infantry battalions of the 168th Regimental Combat Team an Iowa National Guard regiment belonging to the 34th Infantry Division, were placed on 3 separate rocky hilltops, known in the local Arabic as Jebels, named Lesauda, Ksaira, and Garit Hadid. Each position was too far from the next to provide mutual fire support. Seen on a German aerial photograph, they looked like 3 isolated targets waiting for a solution. In the days before the battle, the American front had an atmosphere of routine. Mail was still catching up from Christmas. The war correspondent Ernie Pyle, already in Tunisia, watched young American soldiers dig their slit trenches too shallow and crowd around bonfires at night that any Luftwaffe observer plane could spot from 3,000 meters. The soldiers were eager and optimistic and almost entirely without experience of what a real German panzer assault felt like. They were about to find out. The German offensive came in 2 coordinated lunges. Operation Frühlingwind, meaning spring wind, was the armoured assault through Fort Pass on February 14. Operation Morgenluft, meaning morning air, was Rommel's own Afrika Korps push northward from Guettar the following morning. Together, they formed a pincer aimed at the heart of the American position. At Sidi Bouzid, the crossroads town west of Fort Pass, the 10th Panzer Division hit the American forces at first light. The result was annihilation. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Hightower led 51 Sherman tanks forward in a counterattack later that morning. 7 came back. Hightower's own tank was knocked out, and he made it back to Allied lines on foot across open desert. On the Jebels, Colonel Thomas Drake of the 168th Infantry watched his encircled men run short of ammunition and asked Fredendall for permission to withdraw. Fredendall refused. He ordered Drake to hold and wait for relief that never came. Drake was eventually captured. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, Patton's son-in-law, commanded an armoured task force that had been positioned on and around Jebel Lesauda. He was taken prisoner during the German envelopment. He would not see his family for more than 2 years. By the night of February 16th, the 2nd Corps had lost 1,600 men, nearly 100 tanks, 57 half-tracks, and 29 artillery pieces. American units were falling back west on every available road. They abandoned ammunition dumps, fuel depots, and field kitchens still filled with food. The towns of Spitler and Feriana fell. The fighter airfield at Thalepte was evacuated across the 17th and 18th of February as the 81st Fighter Group's P-39 Airacobras and the 31st Fighter Group's Spitfires flew west to safer ground. On the road north from Guettar, Rommel drove forward through the wreckage and recorded in his diary that he had seen the absolute novelty of an army in flight. He pushed the Italian Comando Supremo in Rome and Field Marshal Albert Kesselring in Sicily for authorization to expand the operation. He wanted to drive through Kasserine Pass, then north to Lekef, then west to Tebessa, cutting the Allied armies in half. Both approved, but they attached a condition. Rommel also had to push a column through the Spiba Pass, 15 miles north of Kasserine, which would divide his already thin forces between 2 axes. It was a compromise that would eventually blunt the offensive. On the evening of February 18th, Rommel did not yet see it that way. That evening he sat down and wrote a letter to his wife. He had written to Lucy from France, from Libya, from Egypt, and from the long desert retreat. The letters were remarkably candid for a man in his position. He wrote about his failing health. He wrote about the strategic situation, which he knew was growing desperate. And now he wrote about the advance, in the tone of a commander who still believed his plan was working. Then, in the middle of the letter, he wrote something that stayed with him. He described how, over the American lines that day, an observation plane had been directing the fire of numerous batteries against worthwhile targets across the entire zone. Read that slowly. A single small spotter plane, circling overhead, was calling fire for multiple artillery units simultaneously across a wide front, and every round, Rommel noted, was finding something worth hitting. He knew artillery. His father had served as an artillery officer. He had spent 2 years fighting British guns in the desert and had learned their rhythms. He had watched the British 25-pounders at El Alamein blanket his positions with massed fire, and he understood what disciplined artillery looked like. What he was describing was something different. A centralized, radio-linked, air-spotted fire control system that could mass the output of several artillery battalions onto a single target in minutes. And this was not from an army that was winning. This was from an army he was routing. He wrote it down. because he was honest enough and professional enough to notice. On the morning of February 19th, the assault on Kasserine Pass itself began. The pass was a gap in the Grand Dorsal Mountains, roughly 1.5 miles wide at its narrowest. The Hatab River, swollen with winter rain, ran through its center. On the east side rose the ridge of Jebel Semama, 800 meters high. On the west stood the twin peaks of Jebel Chambi. Cold rain fell all morning. Fog lay in the wadis. Defending the pass was a scratch collection of units known as Stark Force, after its commander, Colonel Alexander Stark of the 26th Infantry Regiment, which belonged to the 1st Infantry Division. Stark Force included 1 infantry battalion, the 19th Engineer Regiment pressed into service as infantry, 1 field artillery battalion, a tank destroyer battalion, and a battery of French guns. Fredendall, in his final phone call to Stark the night before, told him to go to Kasserine right away and pull a Stonewall Jackson. The morning fog helped the defenders in the first hours. German infiltrators trying to push through the pass in darkness were caught by alert engineers who fired flares and opened up. The first assault was stopped. The second was repelled. But the third and fourth wore the position down through the morning and into the afternoon. By midday, the tanks of the 1st Battalion, 8th Panzer Regiment were committed. Italian Bersaglieri Light Infantry, from the Centauro Armoured Division, went in alongside the Panzer Grenadiers. Their regimental commander, Colonel Luigi Bonfatti, led from the front and died in the assault. By late afternoon, the Bersaglieri had forced open the western approach to the pass. The road west was open. Then came the armoured counterattack that soldiers who survived it never forgot. A column of American light tanks moved forward to blunt the German advance near the western exit of the pass. They saw German armour ahead and charged. From concealed positions on both sides of the road, German 88mm anti-tank guns opened fire. The American forward observer, Edwin Westrate, who was present during the Sidi Bouzid and Kasserine fighting, and later described it in his 1944 book Forward Observer, wrote that it was murder. Tanks rolled straight into the muzzles of the concealed 88s. Tank after tank was blown apart or burst into flames. Those in the rear tried to turn back, but the guns seemed to be everywhere. By nightfall on February 20th, the Germans were through the pass and moving west on 2 axes. Rommel split his force. The Afrika Korps battle group under Brigadier General Karl Bulovius turned west toward Tebessa. The 10th Panzer Division, under Major General Friedrich von Broich, turned north up the road toward the town of Thala. Sources at the time and afterward sometimes gave von Broich a higher rank than he held during this battle. He was a Major General in February of 1943 and would not be promoted to Lieutenant General until May of that year. Thala was the hinge. If Thala fell, the road to Le Kef was open. If Le Kef fell, the British First Army was cut off from its rear. On the night of February 20th and 21st, with von Broich's panzers rolling north and no organised force between them and Le Kef, that danger was very real. What stood in the way was a British brigadier named Cameron Nicholson, whose improvised force, built from the battered remnants of the 26th Armoured Brigade and scattered infantry units, had thrown itself across the road and was holding on. Nicholson's men were exhausted, they were outnumbered, they needed artillery, and they needed it before dawn. On the morning of February 17th, more than 700 miles to the west, in the city of Tlemcen in western Algeria, Brigadier General Stafford Leroy Irwin, the commander of the 9th Infantry Division Artillery, received an order from 2nd Corps headquarters. Move every gun you have to Tunisia. Rommel has broken through. Tlemcen sits in the far western corner of Algeria, near the Moroccan border. The 9th Infantry Division had come to North Africa through Morocco during Operation Torch in November, and had by early 1943 moved its artillery to Tlemcen as a staging area. Irwin's artillery consisted of 205mm howitzer battalions, 155mm howitzer battalion, and 2 cannon companies of 75mm pack howitzers. His 3 infantry regiments were still scattered on other duties. He would be going into combat without them. At 1100 hours on February 17th, he ordered the column to move. 411 vehicles, 138 officers, 2,032 enlisted men. The route ran east through Sidi Bel Abbès, Sétif, Ain Beda, and Tebessa. It rained the entire way. It snowed in the mountain passes. The roads were narrow and largely unpaved. Heavy 155mm howitzers slid off muddy curves in the dark and had to be winched back by hand. Drivers fell asleep at the wheel and were shaken awake by sergeants pounding on the cab. The column drove through 3 days and nights without stopping. It covered 735 miles in approximately 100 hours. At 0400 hours on February 22nd, the guns of the 9th Division Artillery were in firing position on the heights above Thala. Brigadier H.J. Parham, the British First Army's senior artillery officer, met Erwin's commanders and shared survey data, map references, and registered target lists. For the first time in the campaign, American and British artillerymen were working from the same map with the same coordinates. What was now positioned on those heights was 48 American howitzers, joined to what remained of Nicholson's British 25-pounders, all pre-registered on the ground approaches from the south. Behind a thin and exhausted infantry screen, every gun waited. At dawn on February 22nd, the 10th Panzer Division attacked for the last time. Every gun on that mountain opened up at once. The barrage that struck von Broich's leading elements was not yet the formalized time-on-target technique that British artillerymen had developed in North Africa in 1941 and 42, and that American gunners were still refining. Time-on-target calculated firing solutions so that every battery within range delivered its first shell to the same point within the same brief window, offering no time to take cover. But what landed on the 10th Panzer that morning was massed fire, centrally controlled, corrected rapidly by forward observers in concealed positions, and adjusted in real time by spotter aircraft circling above the German column. The effect was the same. The 10th Panzer Division stopped. Von Broich's leading infantry went to ground under airburst shells cracking overhead. Communication wire was cut. Radio antennas were sheared off. The Panzer Grenadiers could not advance. The tanks halted. Von Broich reported that he appeared to face a major Allied counterattack, supported by heavy artillery, and postponed his attack from the morning to mid-afternoon. At approximately 14:15 hours on February 22nd, Rommel drove forward to assess the situation himself. He looked at the ground, heard the guns, and gave the order to break off. The following day, in a meeting with Kasserine, who had flown in from Italy to argue for resuming the assault, Rommel was unmoved. The fuel was nearly gone. The ammunition had been burned. Allied reinforcements were arriving faster than the Germans could destroy them. The Commando Supremo issued formal cancellation orders on the evening of February 23rd. By February 24th, Kasserine Pass was back in Allied hands. Now comes the part that changes everything. Rommel had won the battle. By every conventional measure, it was a German victory. He had taken 50 miles of ground. He had killed, wounded, or captured roughly 6,500 Americans. He had destroyed or captured enough equipment to outfit a full division. The tallies were sent to Berlin. And yet in the notes Rommel kept during those same days, he did not write like a man who had won. He wrote like a man who had been warned. This is the passage drawn from Rommel's operational diary that appears in the Rommel Papers, the collection of his diaries and letters edited by the British military writer Basil Liddell Hart and published in 1953. It is reproduced in the official United States Army history of the North African campaign, in Rick Atkinson's An Army at Dawn, and in the records of the National World War II Museum. It is the verdict Rommel passed on the United States Army in its first major battle. He wrote that the tactical conduct of the enemy's defense had been first class. He wrote that the Americans had recovered very quickly after the first shock, and had soon succeeded in damming up the German advance by grouping reserves to defend the passes and other suitable points. First class, written by the man who had just beaten them. The phrase damming up is the key. Rommel was not describing heroic last stands or brilliant infantry maneuvers. He was describing something technical and systematic. He was describing the way American artillery, even in the chaos of a disintegrating front, had managed to close the gaps and make every further German move costly. The guns at Jebel el Hamra, the guns at Speba, the guns of Nicholson's force at Thala, and above all, Erwin's guns, arriving in firing position after a 735-mile drive in the dark and rain, stopping the 10th Panzer Division's final assault cold at dawn on February 22nd. This was not luck. It was not desperation. It was doctrine, and doctrine alone. In the years between the two world wars, A small group of officers at the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, had quietly built something the world had not seen before. In the spring of 1931, Major Carlos Brewer, the director of the gunnery department at Fort Sill, demonstrated what he called massed battalion fire. Instead of each battery aiming its guns independently at visible terrain features, all 12 howitzers of a battalion were surveyed into exact grid positions on a single firing chart. A single officer at a central fire direction center computed the firing data for all of them at once. Any target, any range, could be solved in seconds. And if a corps commander wanted to put 24 guns, or 48, or 120 on the same point at the same time, the fire direction centers could talk to each other and combine their solutions within minutes. The man who took Brewer's demonstration and formalized the fire direction center as a permanent institution was Major Orlando Ward, the next director of the gunnery department. Ward worked through the early 1930s, building the centralized command and control procedures that became the doctrinal core of American field artillery. In a grim historical irony, Ward later commanded the 1st Armored Division during the disaster at Sidi Bouzid. The man most responsible for building the system that would eventually save the front was also present when the front collapsed. The system had a nervous system, radio. The American Signal Corps had committed early to frequency-modulated radios across the entire field artillery chain. The SCR-608 and SCR-610 sets in the artillery half-tracks. The SCR-609 portable set in the spotter aircraft. Every layer of the American artillery chain, from the observer in the air to the howitzer crew on the gun line, was on the same frequency-modulated net. No static, no jamming, instant correction. The aircraft themselves were a key part of what Rommel had noticed over the American lines on February 18th. Small, slow, and unarmed, the military Piper Cub, officially designated the L-4, had been integrated into American artillery battalions, beginning in 1942, 2 aircraft per battalion. Each one carried a pilot observer and a radio. The observer circled above the battlefield, watched the fall of shot, and talked the gun line onto the target in real time. This was the plane Rommel had described to his wife. This was what made him pause and write it down. The Germans had nothing equivalent. German artillery doctrine, even at the height of Wehrmacht power, was organized around the regiment rather than the corps. Cross-battalion massing existed but was slow and required explicit orders from commanders who were often unavailable. German radios used amplitude modulation, which was more susceptible to jamming and atmospheric interference than the American frequency-modulated sets. The German artillery observation plane, the Fieseler Storch, was large, slow, and available in far too small numbers to be systematic. When a German forward observer called for fire, he was reaching his battery, not his battalion, not his corps. The American observer called his fire direction center. The fire direction center called the battalion. The battalion called the division artillery. The division artillery called the corps. In minutes, if the situation demanded it, a single American forward observer on a hilltop could bring guns from across an entire corps onto a single target, not because of braver soldiers or bigger shells, because of the system. The centralized, layered, radio-connected system of massed fire that had been conceived and tested at Fort Sill in Oklahoma more than a decade before the first American soldier set foot on African soil. It is worth pausing on that for a moment. Most of what failed at Kasserine, the command structure, the infantry positions, the armored counterattacks, the air support, failed because of human errors made under pressure by people who had not yet learned the cost of getting it wrong. But the artillery doctrine did not fail. It had been written down and drilled and tested until it was no longer dependent on individual inspiration. It was institutional, and institutions survive catastrophes that individuals cannot. Rommel was not the first great commander in history to see a losing army's artillery outperform everything around it, and understand what that meant. On the Eastern Front, German field commanders who had shattered Soviet divisions with ease in 1941 were, by 1943, writing despairing reports about the mass and accuracy of Soviet guns. After the Battle of Kursk in July of 1943, German commanders reported that the scale of the Soviet artillery preparation was unlike anything they had faced before. 3,000 gun barrels on a 25-mile front, forward German units suffered catastrophic losses before a single Soviet infantryman had crossed the wire. The British at El Alamein had shown Rommel the same lesson 2 years earlier. Their 25-pounders were coordinated with a precision he attributed directly to his defeat there. The very methods that Montgomery's gunners had used at Alamein were the same ones Brigadier Parham had now brought to Tunisia, sharing his survey data and target lists with Erwin's crews on the night of February 21st. A losing army's artillery, singled out for respect by the enemy who defeated it, marks the seed of that army's recovery. It marks the part of the army that runs on mathematics and doctrine rather than morale and experience, the part that works even when everything else is failing. Back in Algiers, Eisenhower was making his accounting. On February 20th, he sent Major General Ernest Harman to the front as his personal observer. Harman arrived at Fredendall's underground headquarters in the early hours of February 21st, assessed what he found, and reported back with a judgment delivered in plain words. Fredendall was no good and should be relieved. Eisenhower hesitated. Marshall had confidence in Fredendall. Relieving a corps commander after a single defeat carried consequences, but leaving him in place was worse. On March 5, 1943, Eisenhower flew to Tebessa and personally informed Fredendall of his decision. On March 6, Patton arrived at 2nd Corps headquarters and assumed command. Fredendall was sent home to a training assignment in the United States. He never commanded troops in combat again. He retired and died in San Diego in 1963. What Patton brought to 2nd Corps was immediate and unmistakable. He arrived on the morning of March 6th, his command car sirens screaming. Officers were at a leisurely breakfast at 10 in the morning. Within 24 hours, every man in the Corps was required to wear a steel helmet and a necktie at all times. Officers who appeared without proper uniform were fined $25 on the spot. Within 10 days, the Corps was in motion. On March 12th, Patton was promoted to Lieutenant General, his 3rd star finally matching the authority he was exercising on the ground. On March 23, 1943, 37 days after the Fort Pass attack, the 2nd Corps met the 10th Panzer Division again, this time at the Battle of El Guettar, south of Gafsa. The Germans attacked at 6 in the morning, rolling their tanks out of a pass in good order. They ran straight into a minefield. As they slowed to clear it, pre-registered American artillery opened up from multiple battalions, all coordinated through fire direction centers, corrected by forward observers on the hills above. 30 German tanks were destroyed in the first hour. By 9 in the morning, the 10th Panzer was pulling back. It was the first time in the war that an American division had stopped a German panzer division in a prepared engagement. The artillery had done it. In Washington, Eisenhower and the War Department drew their own lessons from Kasserine. On July 21, 1943, the War Department published Field Manual 100-20, titled Command and Employment of Air Power. It established that land power and air power were co-equal and interdependent forces, and that tactical air had to be centrally commanded at the theater level. It abolished the fragmented authority that had made American close air support nearly useless during the Kasserine battle. From the Salerno landings that September onward, American tactical air power functioned as a different and far more lethal instrument. The Field Artillery School at Fort Sill expanded from hundreds of students a year to tens of thousands. Time on target, the technique of massing shells from multiple batteries on a single point simultaneously, had been developed by British artillerymen in North Africa, beginning in 1941 and 42. American gunners built on that foundation and refined it at corps level through the Sicily and Italy campaigns. By the time of the Normandy breakout in the summer of 1944, American corps artillery could deliver the combined fire of hundreds of howitzers so fast that there was no time to take cover and no warning before the first rounds arrived. At Bastogne in December of 1944, when the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded by 4 German divisions, cut off without winter clothing and nearly out of ammunition, the American artillery inside and outside the perimeter kept the town intact until the 4th Armored Division broke through on December 26th. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion alone fired more than 7,600 rounds during the siege. The defenders later credited the accuracy and volume of American artillery fire as the single most important factor in the town's survival. For Rommel, Kasserine was the last advance. On March 6, 1943, the same day Patton was assuming command of 2nd Corps, Rommel attacked Montgomery's 8th Army at Medellin in southern Tunisia with the 10th, 15th, and 21st Panzer Divisions. Montgomery had been warned in advance by signals intelligence and had organized a layered anti-tank defense built around massed artillery. The attack began at dawn and was abandoned at dusk. Rommel lost 52 tanks and gained nothing. He wrote in his diary that it was a complete failure. He was ill, exhausted, and had nothing more to achieve in North Africa. On March 9th, he handed command of Army Group Africa to von Arnim and flew back to Germany. He never returned. His departure went largely unannounced. The men he left behind fought on for 2 more months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. By May 13th of 1943, the entire Axis force in Tunisia, roughly 250,000 soldiers, surrendered. It was the largest Axis capitulation since Stalingrad 3 months earlier. An army had been lost, and with it the last serious chance of defending the Mediterranean shore. Rommel was eventually given command of Army Group B in northern France, responsible for defeating the Allied invasion when it came. In the spring of 1944, he inspected the Atlantic Wall fortifications and wrote his assessments to the German High Command. They were not encouraging. He described the enemy's great superiority in artillery and an outstandingly large supply of ammunition. He described enemy firepower that had broken the front open in Italy. He was writing about the same system he had first noticed over the Tunisian plain in February of 1943, now matured and deployed across an entire theatre of war. On July 17, 1944, 41 days after the Allied landings at Normandy, Rommel's staff car was strafed by Allied fighters on a road near the village of Sainte-Foy-de-Montgomery in Normandy. Rommel was thrown from the vehicle and suffered a severe skull fracture. He was carried home to recover. He was still recovering at his home in Herlingen in October of 1944 when 2 German army generals arrived at his door. General Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hitler's Wehrmacht adjutant and the head of the Army Personnel Office, and General Ernst Meisel, his deputy, had come on behalf of the Führer. Rommel's name had appeared in the confessions of men connected to the July 20th plot against Hitler. He was given a choice: a public trial before the People's Court, which would destroy his family, or a private suicide, reported as death from his wounds, with a state funeral and his family's safety guaranteed. He chose the cyanide capsule. He was driven a short distance from his home, took the poison, and was dead within minutes. He was 52 years old. His son, Manfred, 15 years old at the time, would grow up to serve as Lord Mayor of Stuttgart for 22 years. In the decades after the war, Manfred worked with Basil Liddell Hart to compile his father's diaries, letters, and operational notes into the volume published in 1953 as the Rommel Papers. It is in that collection that the Kasserine assessment survives, drawn from Rommel's running diary and his private correspondence, preserved by a family that had watched its patriarch die in secret on the orders of a man he had served faithfully. The assessment survived because Rommel was a man of unusual professional honesty. He could have written only about the courage of his Panzer Grenadiers. He could have blamed the Commando Supremo for the restrictions on his offensive, and he did blame them. He could have filled the pages with the fuel shortage, which was real, or with the air superiority the Allies were steadily building. He wrote about all those things. But he also stopped, in the middle of a battle he was winning, and recorded honestly what the enemy was doing right. He wrote about the spotter plane and the numerous batteries. He wrote about the first-class conduct of the defense. He wrote about the damming up. And in his later writings from Italy and Normandy, he would return to the same theme, describing Allied artillery that had broken the front open, and an outstandingly large supply of ammunition that could not be countered. Each of those observations grew from the seed of what he first noticed in Tunisia, watching a small American spotter plane circle above the February desert and call down fire from numerous batteries on worthwhile targets. The men who served those howitzers outside Thala did not know they were making history. They had driven 735 miles in roughly 100 hours through Algerian rain and mountain snow. They set up in the dark by survey, stake, and feel. They fired when the mission came. They adjusted when the spotter corrected. They loaded and fired again. They were doing exactly what the field artillery school at Fort Sill had trained them to do. Nothing more and nothing less. But what Fort Sill had trained them to do was, in the private written judgment of the most respected Axis commander of the war, first class. Kasserine Pass is remembered as a defeat, and it was won. Roughly 300 Americans killed, 3,000 wounded, 3,000 taken prisoner, 183 tanks destroyed. The worst single engagement in American military history up to that point. But inside that defeat was a fact Rommel could not explain away, and was honest enough not to try. The American artillery was already, even on its worst day, doing something the Germans could not match, massing fires fast, finding targets with precision, and holding steady under pressure. That single fact, written down by Rommel in the middle of a battle he was winning, became the foundation on which the United States Army rebuilt itself for the rest of the war. Not better tanks, not more brilliant generals, the guns, and the system behind them. The men who worked those howitzers are not famous. Their names appear in unit rosters and battalion after-action reports filed in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Some are buried in the North Africa American Cemetery at Carthage in Tunisia, a quiet place of white marble grave markers on a hill above the Mediterranean, maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission. They did their job well on the worst morning of their army's life, and a great enemy noticed. But Rommel remembered. He wrote it down on February 18, 1943, and the words are still there, in the Rommel papers, for anyone willing to look. The tactical conduct of the enemy's defense had been first class. Not adequate, not better than expected, first class. It is the verdict of a great commander, written in private, with no audience and no reason to flatter. It was paid, in full, to the men who served the guns.